We do not live in a natural world, so we need to accept that as our starting point. If our starting point is some kind of fantasy world that is not real, we're going to make really bad decisions. In a world where nothing is perfect, how do we find the right balance between the different goals that we all have? This human story is ongoing. This isn't the beginning and it's not the ending.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside. On today's show, we're going to explore science, specifically scientific breakthroughs and their convergence across the biggest industries and ecosystems that rule our lives. Joining me for this conversation is the brilliant, world-leading technology and healthcare futurist, Jamie Metzl. Hey Jamie.
Hey Joe, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy that you're going to be joining me for this conversation.
Well, I'm really thrilled about it. I've so enjoyed getting to know you in our visits in Dubai, and it's a crazy world. It's changing so rapidly, and none of us can fully get our arms around it. But by coming together for conversations like these, my hope is that we'll put our minds and hearts together and make progress.
I love that so much. And I know you mentioned Dubai, so this is actually the first time that we're talking virtually, because every time we've met, it's been in person, which is kind of the opposite of what normally happens.
Exactly.
So this is very
We're
cool.
expanding our physical relationship into the virtual world.
Exactly. So I actually had the pleasure, we had two speaker dinners when we were at the Dubai Future Forum. At both dinners, I don't know if you remember this, we sat next to each other.
Yes.
So the first time I was in between Olivier Despy from AXA and Jamie, and then the second dinner between Jamie and Alfonso Montori. So just surrounded by absolutely brilliant people. And that was actually not the first time that I saw your work, because I went to the Basel Novartis Museum of Medicine, and they had this projected video of you running, talking about the future of medicine. So it was quite surreal to be able to meet you in person. Very cool.
That's really, it's funny as somebody I write my books and I do interviews and I just have content that's out in the world. And one of the nice things about that is you have content that becomes separated from you as a person. And it's just circulating. People are reading books on their own, never having met you. And so it's just nice that it's like a piece of me out in the world. And it's also nice to reconnect with real people.
So we got a little teaser of a piece of you and what you do, but why don't we start with an intro into who Jamie is?
So I got to do it.
You do.
All right. Where do I begin? So I'm the son, technically, of a Holocaust survivor. My father was never in a camp. But it really, from early on, made me very, very mindful of values, that values are the key to everything, that every conversation we're having, whether it's about technology or government or politics or power, ultimately, if it is not about values, we're going to get lost. At Brown, my freshman year, I met a classmate of mine who was a survivor of the Cambodian genocide, and I was so inspired by his story that I quit my summer job on the first day, and had a garage sale of all the crap in my parents' house in Kansas City, and bought a ticket to Thailand. I didn't know anyone who'd ever been to Asia, and made my way to a refugee camp and worked with Cambodian refugees in a way that really changed my life. I then did my PhD at Oxford, focusing on why the world failed to respond to the Cambodian genocide, and I worked with the UN in Cambodia for 2 years, and just kind of seeing all the aftermath of all these horrible decisions, it made me realize that really need to travel upstream and say, well, what caused this outcome and what caused that? And if you keep asking why, we get to the point of technology and governance and accountability. I worked for the United Nations as a human rights officer in Cambodia, and then was on the National Security Council for President Clinton. And while I was there, my boss and mentor and now friend, Richard Clarke, who was the guy who became a Cassandra for having predicted 9/11 but not been able to do anything to stop it, he always used to say the key to efficacy in life is to try to solve problems that other people can't yet see. And so this was almost 3 decades ago, but I became really obsessed with the issues of the intersection of biotechnology and science and machine learning and AI, and what that was going to mean for us as humans. I was out evangelizing on those issues and my message wasn't really getting through. And so then I thought I need to find another way of communicating. So I wrote my two near-term sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, talking about these same issues, but from the perspective of stories. And then when I was on book tours for those books, and I would explain the science to people in my way, as someone who was in many ways self-taught, I could see in people's eyes that suddenly they got it. They got that something big was happening. So that was why I wanted to write my next book, my last book, Hacking Darwin, which was about the future of the genetics revolution and human genetics. And then after that book, it got a lot of attention, and I was invited to be a member of the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Human Genome Editing. And I was out in the world saying, this story of the manipulation of human genetics is really important, but it sits within this even bigger story of this new phase of human evolution, where we've reached this stage where we are engineering novel intelligence and re-engineering life. And that was the genesis of what became my new book, Superconvergence.
Wow, well, that was a really dangerous question, I think.
Wait, you can't say, tell me about yourself. It's like I've got 300 hours to go.
Yeah, and a lot of accolades. I mean, also just the breadth of the different work that you've done. And I know that a lot of what you talk about in this book, which is like a truly amazing book, by the way, like
Thank you.
one of my favorite books. I have to read a lot of books for the podcast, but this one I was like relishing it. I think I read it in 3 days. It was incredible.
That's so great.
So well done. But also you do say in here that you are self-taught in science. So like you're constantly expanding your thinking, and you're bringing this kind of sometimes outsider perspective, I think, on topics, which is so beneficial because, as you talk about in the book, it's the convergence of different things. It's the building of future ecosystems that's really going to give us a line of sight of how our world is going to transform. So the ability to be able to connect lots of seemingly disparate things and to understand how one industry will impact another, or how one breakthrough will impact multiple industries, and what the systems are that govern those that will have to change to enable greater adoption of some of these things. Right. So how important is it for you when you're researching one specific thing, whether it's science or technology, that you are constantly pulling yourself back and looking at the bigger picture?
I mean, it's my only option because it's just how my brain functions. But I just think that because I at least see this story as a story of superconvergence, to understand anything, we have to go narrow. But all of that narrowness exists within a much broader context. This conversation, and we're doing it on a computer with a microphone, and these audio sounds are getting translated into the ones and zeros of computer code, and those ones and zeros are embedded in the letters of the computer languages, and the ones and zeros are done in Arabic numbers, which are really Hindu numbers, and the letters of the computer code, those are Latin letters, which are probably more accurately called Phoenician letters. So these ancient codes are the foundation of these new ways of communicating, which are enabling us to have this conversation virtually. I mean, you and I talked at the outset if we were physical friends, and now we're physical plus virtual friends. So this context is enabled because of these technologies. We're able to share it across distance. So what's the implication of that? Well, we have 8 billion people on Earth, and suddenly people can share ideas, not just with the person right next to them in their village, but with everybody all across the globe. So what does that mean? What does that mean for innovation? And there are just some people on planet Earth who we need to say, well, I'm going to focus on this one thing. I'm going to focus on whatever, curing this one disease, solving this one problem. And then we also have people, and I aspire to be one of them, who are saying, well, how do all the pieces fit together? And more significantly, how do we as humans fit into this broader story? Because if people feel it's just the story of technology and we're not part of it, there's a level of enforced passiveness that people can feel. And I think that's very dangerous. When I hear people saying that AGI is coming and humans are the new Neanderthals. I hate it because it's a very passive way of seeing things. We humans are doing these miraculous things, and they stand to have such a positive impact for us and for everybody. But to realize that potential, we need to recognize that we aren't just part of the story. We are the story.
And I like how you pose the reframing of AI as not really being artificial, it's alternative
Right.
intelligence. It's an extension of us. And you write in the book, we're always using tools to help us to advance, and evolution of our biology takes a very, very long time. And so to speed that up, we're extending it through the use of technology. So to your point, it's almost like the next stage of our evolution, enabling not a change in who we are, but an ability for us to survive, particularly in the current challenges that we have. We need to be thinking about human beings in the context of change, that change is a part of not only life, but a part of us as human beings, that we started as single cell organisms, that we have evolved to what we are today, that change for us to adapt to our environment is a very natural thing that we have to accept when we're thinking about what's ahead for us in the future.
Absolutely. So we have co-evolved with our technology for many thousands of years, if not longer. I mean, really, since the domestication of fire allowed us to cook food and basically externalize biological processing of nutrients that gave us the capacity to grow these greater and more effective brains, to have stronger social organization. I mean, we've co-evolved with our technologies for a very long time. But our biological capacity, our brain capacity today is pretty much exactly like it was 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. So then we have to say, well, what's the reason why we can live these lives now, but 20,000 years ago, our predecessors with brains just like ours couldn't do these things? And the answer, of course, is our cultural inheritance, that we are coming together and we are sharing our knowledge, and that every generation is able to build upon the knowledge of past generation, that for every one of us, our starting point doesn't have to be reinventing things that have already been invented, solving problems that have already been solved. Innovation is really happening at a civilizational level. Yes, we glorify brilliant people, the Demis Hassabises of the world, and we need these kinds of geniuses to take us one step forward. But we need to recognize it's one step forward from where? Like, nobody was inventing AI in the 5th century because the ingredients weren't there. Now the ingredients are here, and we have brilliant people who can take us one step further. And that's why this is such an exciting moment in my view.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's also scary, right?
Yes.
Because there's a lot that obviously there's a lot that we don't know. But particularly even when you were talking about some of the massive breakthroughs that have come in the past, particularly with like gene editing, it's required a lot of experimentation, and generally the reaction is one of fear, that from a more moral perspective, that maybe we, in our quest to experiment and find how to best use scientific or technological breakthroughs, that we step over some moral line that we probably don't even all agree on as a collective society. So I guess I'm curious what your take is on the role of experimentation in science and the freedom to be able to push the boundaries.
Yeah, it's a great and really important question. And I say this a lot. If you aren't super excited by all of these technologies, you're missing the story. And if you aren't really afraid by all of these same technologies for many of the same reasons, you're also missing the story, because for every technology, there's an exciting upside and a scary downside. You get all of these innovations are as a result in many ways of agriculture, and you get pandemics, world wars, and nuclear weapons. With stirrups, you think, well, who could be upset about stirrups? But when the Mongols put together stirrups and archery, then they had these massive cavalries that took over at that point their known world and led to tens of millions of deaths. So these technologies can and will do wonders, and they can and will do harms. And so certainly in this world where individuals are super empowered, we are all beneficiaries of empowered individuals. But at the same time, I believe it's entirely appropriate and even necessary for societies to try to draw lines about what is and what isn't okay. And that has to be based on some kind of calculus of risk and reward. And so there are some people who are just saying, let's pull the plug on AI or ban DIY biocenters or any of these kinds of things. None of those things actually make sense, and most of them aren't possible. But it is possible to have real governance and accountability measures that apply to everybody. There are some people, especially in our community, Joe, of kind of futurists, and they're all the kind of DIY people, the biohackers, and you have people who are doing stuff on themselves, which seems a little bit crazy to me. Shouldn't we have reasonable governance and regulatory systems for people who are doing things like virology research? As you know, Joe, I've been at the center of efforts to ask really fundamental questions about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I believe and have believed since early 2020 that the vast majority of the available evidence points towards a research-related incident in Wuhan. Accidents happen. So for sure, we need to have some kind of red lines. And I think the people who are saying no governance in whether it's social media or virology research or all of these kinds of areas, I don't think that's appropriate, because we live in an era of superpowered individuals. And that's great, but quoting Superman's uncle, with great powers come great responsibilities. And that has to happen not just on an individual level for individuals monitoring themselves, but we need systems for governance and regulation.
And we need more people to be asking objective, unbiased questions or exploring these without emotions weighing into it, which I really like, because in the book you break down some of the things that are transforming industries like food and agriculture and the farming industry, from plant-based to meat reduction to cell-based or cultivated food. Maybe it's this bias that we generally have in narratives, mainstream narratives today, that I was expecting, as I was reading, I was expecting you to say, this is amazing and it's going to solve all of our problems, or this is terrible and it's going to destroy the farming industry. And you say a little bit of both. It's very fair and objective, which I really like. And you also weigh the, like you're saying just then, weigh the role of the individual, the government, broader ecosystems that we have to be able to scale some of these things to get them to a point where they're mainstream. Because a lot of what you talk about is still very niche or evolving, or like in one example that you gave in medicine, which I thought was really interesting, was biology risk scoring, for example. So a probabilistic assessment of what kind of ailments I might have in the future based on my genetics, I guess, and my lifestyle habits and the environment that I live in. I mean, all of that seems really like sophisticated and maybe would give me a better healthcare outcome. Maybe would make me smarter as well about what I'm doing with my body. But then also obviously leads to pretty significant risks around government regulation or even excessive charges for my healthcare, et cetera. So I love that you pose a lot of these things as, hey, we need to consider all of the broader implications and consequences of some of these things that are emerging.
Yeah, and thank you for highlighting that. I mean, obviously, I agree with you agreeing with me. But I mean, that's the basic point. These are possibilities, and to turn them into realities, we have to do the work. And none of these technologies are panacea. The people who are the techno-optimists, who believe that technologies on their own are going to solve all of these problems, I think that's actually a very dangerous way of thinking. technologies don't come with their own built-in value systems. And every technology, no matter how seemingly benign, has upsides and downsides. And so the question for us is not, do we have one thing and that's going to solve all of our problems? It's how do we think about starting to do things differently, maybe in a small way, and growing those capacities over time. And sometimes the solutions to past problems become problems in and of themselves. And climate change is a great example of that. I mean, right now, climate change is such a problem because of industrialization. And while industrialization had many negative consequences, including colonization, many other things, industrialization ultimately was the biggest driver of radically reducing slavery in most parts of the world, because we just had another way of doing things, whether it's making things or growing things. And now we have a problem that industrialization has scaled so much that it's leading to global warming, which is creating its other problem. I mean, we could, and I believe should, transition our industrial animal agriculture significantly towards cell cultured, cultivated milk and meat products, and we will create some other set of problems that we're not foreseeing now. And so the ultimate issue here is not that there is one technology that's going to save us. That is not the case. The ultimate issue, and the reason why I write my books, the reason why I love having conversations like this, is to say that if this is about values, it's about identifying what are the core values, what are we trying to achieve as humans, and then how, of all of the resources available to us, and technology is just one of those things, the technologies, the relationships, the organizations and associations, how do we bring them together to work as aggressively and humanely as possible toward achieving our goals? And that's why I always tell people, technology brings us to this conversation, but this is not a conversation ultimately about technology. It's a conversation that's ultimately about values.
Right, because technology is a reflection of us, not just because we have created it, but in the way that we design it. So do you think that we should be designing things with a contingency almost? So thinking about the consequence or the thing that could go wrong with this. I mean, I think data centers are a great example of that, and the amount of carbon emissions that we're starting to see generated from new data centers that are being built to sustain all of this growth in AI. Is that, I mean, no one's going to do that because it's going to cost more money on something that you don't know which consequence is going to play out. But is that kind of thinking more of what we need and how we design things?
I think yes. I would say yes, asterisk, because it's for exactly the reasons that you said. There are stakeholders in racing forward. Like right now, we're experiencing it in AI and all these other. There are all these pressures for racing forward. There's competition between societies, between governments, between companies, and the incentive to be cautious is actually much less. And with the rate of technological change accelerating, that mismatch becomes even greater. And that's why, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have drank our own Kool-Aid, that the only thing that we need to do to solve the world's problems is empower a bunch of Spectrum-y kids in their garages, or give Elon Musk, the keys to the United States Treasury and government. Nothing will destroy us sooner than doing that. There is a reason why so many people have invested in building these structures of laws and norms and behaviors and institutions. And yes, there are all kinds of problems. Yes, they are inefficient. Yes, they're imperfect. Yes, they're badly in need of reform. But this tendency to say, well, let's just burn down the whole thing. And I'm not just saying that this is a tear it down from Silicon Valley. We see it on the far left and the far right of the political spectrum. Just burn the whole thing down, I think, is extremely dangerous. And that way, I'm a classical liberal, that I believe that building these societal structures for helping us manage and balance different interests is really important. And we've codified a lot of those things in our democracy. And that's why for this book, I've tried to write it in a very accessible way, meaning anybody of any background, I hope, can read it and understand it and feel like they're part of that conversation. Because we all need to play a role in figuring out, what do we do now? And there's some really big decisions. I mean, we're seeing it day to day playing out in America's democracy, but there are decisions that we're going to be making about healthcare, about, like I wrote about in my last book, Hacking Darwin, how do we think about using the tools of assisted reproduction in ways that may shift over time our evolutionary trajectory as a species? How do we think about food production? How do we think about energy? And the reason why I can talk about these relatively small scale examples now and imagine what they could be at a larger scale is that when talking about these biological systems, we can just see right in front of us how quickly biological systems can scale. That if you stop plowing a field, it doesn't take that many years for things to grow in that field. And we know that a lot about living systems because living systems already exist. In the book, I write about Carl Benz in his workshop in the 1880s inventing the car. And his model, what he was looking at, was a horse carriage. And so there had been a lot of innovations in horse carriages for how to use wheels and how to put four wheels together. And that was the starting point. But imagine that Carl Benz had a Porsche in his workshop in the 1880s. And every time he said, oh, here's a problem, how do I solve this? He would just go and open the hood of the Porsche and look around and say, oh, hey, that's a good idea. That's what we have with nature. Nature is the Porsche parked in our workshop. We want to say, well, how do we store data for millions of years reliably versus the 40 to 60 years of data stored on magnetic tape in our data center? Well, you can go to Carl Benz's workshop and look at DNA, which has solved that problem through billions of years of evolution. So I do think it makes me very optimistic about what's going to be possible for us because we already have just right adjacent to where we are some pretty incredible models, and we are going to increasingly understand those models using our new tools and then manipulate those models and then start creating parallel models, even living systems of our own.
It's an incredible future that awaits us, particularly if, as you say, we can unlock some of the knowledge that already exists or some of the structures of the systems like DNA, like the way that nature regenerates naturally in itself. I'm a little sad that you said that you wrote the book really simply because I really struggled in some parts.
I didn't say I wrote it simply.
I
didn't say I wrote it simply. I wrote it with the hope, and you can say that I failed in that hope, that anybody who's reading it could find it accessible and enjoyable. But you're not the first person in the last hour and a half who has said they read it and enjoyed it and just felt overwhelmed because there was a lot in there.
There is a lot. I took a ton of notes, and I like to write in my books, so there's a lot of scribbles in here.
Well, can I tell you just one quick story connected to that? So over the New Year's, I was in New Zealand, and I was actually, this is a little embarrassing, but once a year I lecture on a super luxury cruise. And so I was lecturing on this cruise, and on the first day of the cruise, one of the waiters at this little restaurant came up to me and we just started chatting, and he was from Zimbabwe and clearly a really smart guy. And in 2 seconds, I realized this guy who was just so hungry for knowledge. And he started just asking me things. And every time I'd answer a question, he would ask another question because he just realized he came to feel like I was a knowledge resource for him. And so every time I saw him for the next few days, he would just ask more and more just really great questions. And so I had a copy of this book, Superconvergence, that I was planning to donate to the library on this ship. But instead I thought, I'm going to sign it to this guy and give it to him. And so I did that, and he exactly like you, Joe, he then read the book in 3 days. Then he said he was rereading the book and highlighting it and making notes for himself. And then he said he was planning to go back to his village in Zimbabwe, and he's a a member of the San tribe. I don't know if you remember the old movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy from the 80s, but they're traditionally nomadic hunter-gatherers. And he said that he was going to do a training for the people of his village because they used to be hunter-gatherers, but now what they call hunting, other people call poaching. And so they're being forced to stay where they are and do farming, which they've never done. And he said they're all just really confused about what they should do, about how much technology, how little technology. And so it just really meant a lot to me. When you write a book, you never know where it's going to go. You never know how many people are going to read it. But I certainly felt that if all I had was one reader, and it was that guy, now two readers, that guy and you, that would be success. But I'm hoping that I've written a book that's successful. But I told Elizabeth Vargas, the journalist, I said, I've written this. It's supposed to be a beach read. And then she was all pissed off. She said this on the air. Like, I took it to the beach. I don't know if that was a beach read.
I read it. I was in a snowy cabin in Michigan, took a little holiday. And so we had the fireplace and a hot chocolate and your book. So it's not exactly a beach read. It's not exactly a cabin in the snow, relaxing read, but my God, it was insightful. And I felt sorry for my poor husband because every once in a while I'd be like, so did you know that we eat 73 billion land animals a year?
Yeah.
These not so fun facts, which were scattered throughout, and this kind of evidence of the world that we're living in, and some very kind of confronting things.
Yes.
So you sort of read it as a fact of life, and then maybe pause a little bit to say, what am I doing that I could be doing differently as an individual? But I want to go back to something you said before, which is that life is getting better, which is true, right? Like by most accounts, life on Earth is improving, even with the population growth that we have.
Right.
And I think even the statistic that you say around 260% more meat eaten per person in the last 50 years, way outpacing population growth. So we can access more protein, meat protein. We live longer. We are wealthier. By all accounts, life is improving. And yet we have these kind of very real catastrophes that are facing us. And we have a lot of other social, cultural, societal divisions and splits, and this kind of uneven ground that we're standing on. So even though we're standing on it healthier and better off, the ground itself feels really unstable. It's a really big question, but I know that you're an optimist, but do you feel like life is heading in the right direction?
So I don't feel like it's heading in the right direction, but I certainly feel like we are so much better off than our ancestors. As a matter of fact, we're so much better off that we have forgotten how terrible things were so recently. Here in the United States, we're now having this debate about vaccines. Nobody would have had a debate about vaccines in the 1950s when so many children were dying of polio and people were living with absolute terror. If people remembered the joy felt when the polio vaccine was announced in the 1950s. Here where we are in North America, where about 90% of the indigenous native populations died as a result of diseases brought over from the old world, if there had been a smallpox vaccine, our entire history would have been different. An entire group wouldn't have been brought to almost total annihilation. And now we're having this debate about whether vaccines are good or bad. I mean, it's a level of, I would call it insanity, but I think a better word is amnesia. And certainly here in the United States and in other parts of the world where past generations fought and died to lay the groundwork for the democracies, for the free world in which we now live, that it feels like we're doing to ourselves what our adversaries have wanted to do to us for many, many, many decades. And so it's certainly true that from a historical perspective, now is the best time to ever be alive. And it just keeps getting better. More people are educated. More people are well fed. There are more people. We're living longer. Everything pretty much on average is just always getting better. But everything that is happening exists within a context. It's not that that smallpox was eradicated on its own. It's not that global literacy has increased percentage-wise on its own. We have done it, and we've done it by building institutions, we've done it by funding efforts, we've done it by all of these things. And if we don't recognize the miracle of our success and feel that we can just knock these things down, knock down the United Nations, knock down U.S. efforts to support international development, knock down the structures promoting world health, and these things are just going to continue, that's insanity. You don't have to have a PhD in history to ask the question, why don't we live in the Egyptian Empire? Why don't we live in the Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, all those things? Because all those things have, for one reason or another, collapsed. Good things are good as long as you invest in making them better. But the second you take them for granted, things can just as easily collapse. So I'm optimistic, but that doesn't mean that I believe progress is inevitable. We will have progress as long as enough people invest in and fight for progress.
Right, and stay humble throughout that process is also what you're saying. Maybe stop complaining about the small things.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well, if we had that kind of perspective, it's, oh my God, I had a shitty day. It's, oh, but at least a nuclear bomb wasn't dropped on my head. It's like, a nuclear bomb, I had Ebola. Yeah.
Yeah, at least I don't have malaria. It's the comparison points are really important. And going back to the gentleman on the ship, what was his name?
Well, I'm going to tell you his name because he comes from one of these Kalahari tribes, and they don't speak in 100% clicks. They speak in a mix of clicks and different noises. So I'm going to say it slowly, and then I'll say it faster. And if you're watching in the name, I apologize for mispronouncing it. So it's this. Here's the way I thought he was saying it. Toe. So a click, and then as if you're saying boon, B-U-N, but no sounds were coming out of it. So it was like, and then toe says toe. The other people on the ship who were his colleagues on the crew, they called him Bunto. So because I think this is, as far as I know, your audience, Joe, doesn't speak the clicking language, which I don't speak, Bunto.
Shout out to Bunto. There is an interesting point that he mentioned to you, which is connected to this kind of point around history and where we are, which is this recognition that you confront in the book that no one is living a truly natural lifestyle anymore. There is no such thing as the old way, going back to the old way of doing things, because we have evolved so far. And I think you give the example of, I think it was banana or like one of the fruits that just, maybe it was corn. It was corn that just looks completely different, which actually showed up on my feed because obviously my AI is listening to me just a few days before. And yeah, it looks completely different. I mean, the food that we eat, the way that we live, the environment that we're living in, the air quality, etc., everything is different. And so embracing the technological advances that we have should be a good thing, should be a positive for us to, I guess, recognize the benefits of all of the things like being able to, spray our food so that it doesn't get infected, that it lasts longer, etc. This is a reality that there is no such thing as going back to the way that things were.
It's really a balance. And I certainly believe that there's a very fair question to say is if we're growing all these corn and soybeans in the United States, is it better to use the genetically modified seeds, which the farmers want to plant, or is it better to use many more pesticides and insecticides? And I think that we should at least have the conversation, and I would lean toward the genetic modification. We've had 50 years of testing by all kinds of entities, and there's been never a single study showing that the human consumption of genetically modified crops is unsafe for humans. But that doesn't mean there aren't very real issues, and it doesn't mean that the civil society groups aren't raising important issues about diversity of our seeds and crops, about whether the levels of corporate control over essential food supplies. It doesn't mean that there aren't other avenues for achieving some of these same ends, other forms of more sustainable traditional agriculture, like not just crop rotation, but there's a thing of having domesticated animals graze in different croplands. I mean, there are all kinds of great strategies. The problem is scaling, because to feed 10 billion people, we're going to have some kind of industrial processes. And the other problem is things are changing so fast as a result of climate change and, frankly, population growth. We have billions of people living in traditional agricultural lands around the equator that are getting warmer. The old-fashioned way of dealing with this problem would have been there would have been a series of droughts, and most of the crops would have died, and most of the people would have died, but some of the crops would have survived because they just, by chance, they had genetic mutations that made them more survivable in times of drought. And then the people who survived would grow those surviving plants, and those plants would expand, and then you'd get more people, and that would happen again and again and again. And that's why we have relatively resilient domesticated plants, and we have relatively resilient humans, because we are the survivors of countless series of near starvations where our ancestors were the ones who made it. But we're not going to do that now. We aren't going to have billions of people starve to death because of global warming. We aren't politically going to have billions of people migrating to Canada and Russia and other places where life will be in some ways better as a result of climate change. So what are we going to do? I mean, that's the starting point. And I believe that thinking about the application of biotechnology to the biotechnology that is agriculture isn't just appropriate, it's absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm. And it's really exciting. I mean, I know that it's not perfect, and you outlined something in the book which I actually wasn't aware of, that it is dependent on the traditional meat industry right now in the way that it's designed and grown, or engineered, I should say.
Yeah, and just a reference for listeners, you're talking about the fetal bovine serum. When making cell-cultured animal products, traditionally you need a fetal bovine serum, which actually comes from living animals. And there's the thing is, how do we replace that? Sorry.
Right, and the fetal part is the bit that might make some people, like myself, a little bit uncomfortable. But then, look at the rest of the meat industry and what we're eating. Like, we're eating veal and we're drinking cow's milk. And no industry right now in the food agriculture space, no facet of it is perfect. Things have to evolve. And so with things like cultivated, I actually had a great conversation with George Pepperpoo, the CEO of VOW, which you do mention in the book, although you don't mention their name. I was like, oh, he's going to mention VOW. I was just talking to them. And what they're doing. I mean, you're talking about 153 companies that are experimenting in this space. So a lot of really exciting things happening. And what's really striking about that is that they're trying to really think about how they bring science into the way that we create food. So what if we could have a beef burger that has all of the nutrients of salmon? Why can't we be thinking about it in that way? It feels, I think, for a lot of people, very unnatural. Like, I just want to, I want to know where my steak comes from. I want to know what the cut is, and I want to know it was roaming around on a farm.
People kind of want to know, and they kind of don't want to know. And in the sense that if people really knew where most of their animal products come from, they would actually be disturbed. I'm not a vegetarian, and I drink milk, my hot chocolate every single morning. But people imagine Old McDonald's farm, but most of the animal products are not coming from Old McDonald's farm. They're coming from animals in these industrial settings. The average cow on their own can live 20 years. The average milk cow lives 5 years. They all get arthritis because they're just continually essentially pregnant or post-pregnant. It's a horrible life. And when people talk about natural, I don't think the thing that people are imagining as being natural is not what natural is. We do not live in a natural world. If by natural we mean the way our ancestors lived, not even we were hunter-gatherers, but before the deck was entirely stacked in our favor. Like hunter-gatherers, before we had domesticated fire and had all these weapons that let us wipe out all of the megafauna wherever we went. That was natural. We were just one animal, and sometimes we ate the other guy, and sometimes the other guy ate us. We don't live in that world. So we need to accept that as our starting point. If our starting point is some kind of fantasy world that is not real, we're going to make really bad decisions. And so that's why for me, the question is just, in a world where nothing is perfect, how do we find the right balance between the different goals that we all have? And we don't all have the same goals. And that's why democracy is so important, whether it's here domestically or any other country or anywhere in the world. This human story is ongoing. This isn't the beginning and it's not the ending. And for those of us who want to have a better future, we need to be just continually investing in building that future in every action that we take, from the biggest ones to the smallest ones.
How can we get more personally empowered and maybe more educated as well? Because as an Australian living in the US, I would say democracy is well and truly alive here. The people have a vote. But do they know what they're voting for? How are they manipulated into how they vote? Maybe is the question. And so that's why it's so important to just learn more. I mean, how could you understand things better, ask more questions, foresee the potential implications or consequences, and get excited about the future that involves technology and science with your eyes wide open?
Yeah, I think that's so important. Just this last summer, I was the keynote speaker at this wonderful place in upstate New York called Chautauqua. They have this huge outdoor auditorium. I think it fits 6,000 people, and 6 U.S. presidents have spoken there. It's a very historic place. And so I went to all the different speakers of AI Week, and every one of them, except for my brilliant friend Andrew Steer, every other one of the speakers was AI is coming, the sky is falling. It's easy to scare people, and it's easy to be a doomer, and there are reasons to be scared. But this isn't a story just about being scared. And that's why I think that I'm so glad that you're framing things in this way. And obviously it's what I believe, that there's an potential upside and a potential downside. But that is the work. That is the work of all of us, is to increase the odds of the good stuff and decrease the odds of the bad stuff. And democracy is our way of coming together, because maybe people have different definitions of what fits in each category. So we need to have some process for coming together so we can act collectively.
Yeah, and like openly discussing and honestly discussing some of these things and staying curious about the what if. So speaking of curiosity, Jamie, my last question for you is exactly that. So with my dog tearing up her bed in the background, obviously you're very naturally curious. So what is your go-to when you're trying to gain a fresh perspective and get yourself out of your own bubble?
Those of us, certainly you and me, and I think many other people, we're just constantly seeking new information, and we constantly have data and information and stories coming at us. And in a way, it's great. But for me, stepping back from that and just thinking is so important, because I don't even think we realize, I certainly don't realize how disrupted my own thinking is. And it's funny, years ago, I was on a international flight. I think I was coming from Hong Kong back to New York. I can't remember. I was reading this book, and I was so focused that at the end of the flight, somebody said to me, I've never seen any person read a book as intensely as you have just read that book. It was like 10 hours of just... But now I feel like there's so much stuff. ADD is being forced on us. And so one of the things is to get out of the stream a little bit. I'm an ultramarathon runner. So at least for part of my runs, I just try to turn everything off. And it's so traditional that's what the transcendentalists and Thoreau and Whitman, they say, just kind of get away. And I think that's really important. But then there's the question of into what spaces do we need to step to challenge things? Because again, you and I are in this world of futurists and futurism, and we're getting all of this information. But as we've been discussing, this is a broader story. It's not just about what the technology is doing. And so for me, I spend a decent amount of my time traveling, just trying to, I'm not saying I'm great at it, but just to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes to see the other story. And so I do think that in addition to following curiosity, what I tell people is, if there's whatever your scariest thing that you feel like, oh my God, I could never understand that, that seems really hard, just go straight at it. And even if you fail, let it be a glorious failure, and you'll learn something from that. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Just allow yourself to think about things, like take a moment, try to not get distracted by the many easy distractions that we have.
So just give one example. You talked about your dog, who I can't see because is it a boy or a girl?
It's a girl.
A girl, because she is outside of the frame.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about having that was a loving look to the dog. That was very sweet.
But annoying, but yeah.
One of the wonderful book that I read last year was, and it's called An Immense World by Ed Wong. It got a lot of attention. And it really tried to get into the perspective of how do animals perceive. And he talks a lot about dogs, but all these other animals. And I thought it was great because it inspired, so like here you are in a room with your dog. Your dog is having a totally different experience than you are having right now. Mm-hmm. And yet, like, how far could you or we go to getting in your dog's head from your dog's perspective? It's the same point that I made in the beginning of our conversation about artificial intelligence versus alternative intelligence versus machine intelligence. And it's not that we could know it, but the process of trying to know it itself is expanding. And it's connected to the point that you made earlier about humility, but it's really the balance between hubris and humility. Our species is inherently hubristic. It sounds negative, but it's our greatest attribute. And we understand so little relative to the full complexity of those systems. So we have to live with a sense of immense curiosity, immense wonder, immense respect for other people and for the possibility that we don't know everything. And then again, that's why coming together into learning communities like we're doing right now, I think is so important.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that we never stop asking questions. Like, I would love to know what is going through my dog's head. And like, I want to break down that creature and understand her more deeply. But if you asked her, she'd be like, no, I just want to be here with you in the moment. So there's also a little bit of that going back to the hubris humility that you're talking about.
Unless your dog, because we don't know, unless your dog is a total cynic and it's, oh, this person's feeding me every day. I seem to get a positive response when I do this thing. I like being fed. It's easier than my ancestors did when they had to hunt in the wild. I'm just going to go with it.
Exactly.
But I think it's love. I think it's love.
I think so too. Yeah, and she gets fed every 5 minutes. So yeah, it's working in her favor. She's doing well.
Yeah.
Jamie, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. So excited to see where we go, and thank you for being a voice of that future. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Joe. It's really been my pleasure.